Irreverent, entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Inner Voice with Dr. Foojan Zeine, only on LA Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Inner Voice Show. I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine, and this show is about all that matters in life for you. Your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, the way that you impact the world, and all that matters with the relationships that you have. I talk about research, the latest research, and I also interview the expert in the field of cognitive sciences and social humanities and all of that. Today, I'm actually not going to give you any of the latest research because my guest, Dr. Christine Padesky, has a lot of research. So I didn't want to take your time with other types of research because I know that she has the best for you. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dr. Christine Padesky.
Dr. Foojan Zeine is a psychotherapist, a marriage and family therapist, and a life coach with more than 27 years of experience. She is the author of the Awareness Integration Model, which has been researched and published in numerous international journals. Dr. Foojan has offices in Beverly Hills, Irvine, and Woodland Hills, California, and also consults online and by telephone. Make an appointment with her today by calling 818-648-2140 or go online to www.foojan.com. That's www.foojan.com. Were you recently injured in a car accident? Then you need the law offices of Aria Thadakar for your free case evaluation. Don't let the medical bills pile up, and don't let the insurance companies try to settle your claim for a few $100s. Call 714-464-3246. The law offices of Aria Thadakar serves all of California. If they don't win, you don't pay. So call now, 714-464-3246. This is a paid-for attorney advertisement by the law offices of Aria Thadakar of Orange, California.
Have you ever wished you could just wake up one day, reach across your nightstand, and hit the life reset button? Let's face it, the struggles and frustrations of everyday life leave millions of women and men around the globe yearning for a new way. And the new way is right here in Life Reset, the awareness integration path to create the life you want by Dr. Foojan Zeine. You can get it now at Foojan.com or Amazon.com. Life Reset, the awareness integration path to create the life you want. You deserve it. Welcome back, everyone, to Inner Voice Show. I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine, and I'm so excited to have Dr. Christine Padesky with me. She's a leading cognitive therapy innovator, and she provides workshops and consultation to therapists worldwide. You can find her at Padesky.com. She develops audio, CD, and DVDs for therapist training, and she's also the co-founder of the Center for Cognitive Therapy in Huntington Beach, California, and the co-creator of Strength-Based Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. She's considered one of the leading CBT presenters in the world, appreciated for her depth of knowledge, compassion, and good-humored warmth. She does have that. I've been on many of her presentations. She's presented over 450 workshops to more than 50,000 professionals throughout the North and Southern America, Europe, Asia, and as well as 25 workshops with the cognitive therapy founder, Dr. Aaron Beck. And I'm so glad to have you with me today, Dr. Padesky.
Well, thank you, Foojan. My pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, that's very true. I've been in many of your workshops, and your warmth, your humor, the crisp clarity of how you explain what happens within us. It's really engaging, and I always learn a lot from you, and I have the opportunity to share you with my audience. So it's really it's great to have you with me. And I know that you also have been a co-author of Mind Over Mood book, and also the second edition, and it's been translated to 12 languages. So can you talk a little bit about Mind Over Mood? And then from there, we're going to go and explain different moods and anxiety and go from there. Go ahead.
Great, certainly. Mind Over Mood is a book that Dennis Greenberger and I wrote, which is designed to teach people evidence-based skills that can help them manage different moods like depression, anxiety, anger, guilt, shame. And it's really designed as a self-help workbook, although many, many therapists use it as part of therapy when they're doing cognitive behavior therapy, which is one of the therapies that's been shown to be, in research, to be really effective for different mood problems. So today I thought I'd kind of zoom in on part of that book, which is some of the things that we teach people about managing anxiety. But the Mind Over Mood does cover methods that work for many, many different moods.
Many different moods. One of the conversations that I've had with clients, and I've seen it very much in my practice in shifting and changing, is the highest level of anxiety that is brought upon many reasons. One is social media. Another part is the actual media producing a lot of fear. The concept of the unknown as technology moves us forward. And the kids are growing up really fast with kind of like no known way of being. I've also seen a lot of anxiety starting in young children, which, we really didn't see that a lot in 10, 15 years ago. And we're seeing full-blown anxiety attacks and panic attacks and all of that starting much younger in population that I have ever seen in my office. What are your thoughts about anxiety, and then explaining what anxiety is, and then taking it from there and letting us know what's your equation on it?
Certainly. And I think we can understand the increase of anxiety when we understand what causes anxiety. And really, you need two things to be anxious. The first thing is you need to have a sense that there's a great deal of danger. But danger in and of itself won't make us anxious. Many people thrive on danger. Somebody likes to drive fast cars, for example. There's a certain amount of danger in driving fast, but if you think you can handle that car, then a certain amount of danger gives us a thrill or excitement. The second thing besides danger that we need to feel anxious is we need to have a sense that the danger is greater than our ability to cope. And so this interplay between danger and coping is what makes us anxious. So when we feel danger has gone up, then we're more likely to be anxious unless we think we're really good at coping. Or even with mildly dangerous situations, like something that a lot of people might not think is dangerous, like just going into a meeting where we have to talk with some other people. If you don't have confidence that you can cope with questions people are going to be asking you, or you can't cope with meeting new people, then you're going to feel quite anxious in that situation, even though the danger may not be super high. If the danger is greater than our ability to cope, then our perceived sense of our ability to cope, then we're going to feel anxious. So I think the reason we're seeing more anxiety today is there's a lot more information through the internet and news about potential dangers out there. And also I think sometimes when we see these big dangers in the world, for instance, people who might be worried about immigration issues or things like that, where we don't think there's anything we individually can do to cope and make it better, then that gives rise to lots of anxiety.
Absolutely. I think that the essence of the global information that pours in, it has both effect, where in some sense we have this ability to know more, but also have the ability to see how much more we're not in control of, and what is the area of the limited control we have versus all that's upon us that may affect us, but there's not much we could do. And I've seen that go from anxiety to anger. So there's a lot more of also anger being produced and expressed, much more than the anxiety, which is a lot of the anger. The underneath feeling of that is anxiety, which then produces the anger.
Yes, and the kind of theme in anger is a theme of unfairness.
Yes.
It's not fair that this is happening. And when we sense, so the danger, we might react first with anxiety because we say, oh my gosh, this is dangerous and I can't do anything about it. And then if we think about it in addition, we think, and it's unfair, this shouldn't be happening, then you're right, anger is going to quickly follow.
Mm-hmm. And when the anxiety comes, I've always sensed it in three different ways. When a cognitive or a thought, a belief system shows up, and then side by side the anxiety shows up, and then the chemical aspects of our body gets us ready to do something about it. So on the other side also, working through it, like people who are listening to us, if they wanted to actually manage their own anxiety, it seems like they also got to manage it not only physically, emotionally, but also cognitively. Can you talk a little bit about the way to recognize your own anxiety and then how to be with it and how to, let's say, release it? Because a lot of people avoid it or try to kind of just shove it somewhere and not necessarily deal with it.
Sure. And in fact, most people, when we get anxious, our number one instinct is to avoid. Sometimes it's, people have sometimes heard of the flight or fight response, and you talked about our physiology gets aroused when we get anxious. And sometimes if we feel like we can cope and overcome what the danger is, then we get mobilized to deal with it. But much more often, with anxiety, we don't think we can cope, and so we want to flee from it. We want to run away. We want to avoid. The problem with that is the more we avoid things that scare us, the scarier they become. Mm-hmm. So, for example, many people have small children who are afraid of monsters in the bedroom, or we ourselves might have once been afraid of monsters in the bedroom as a small child. And we know that if we just say we think a monster's in the closet, if we close the closet door and we never look in there, then our image of this monster gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But if we actually go up and look in the closet, maybe with our parents' help, and we look all around and we see there's no monster there, then our anxiety has a chance to go down. So the problem with avoidance is that it actually helps us stay anxious because we never get to test out. The first part is the fear, is the danger as bad as we think? And the second part, if there is real danger, is it something we could cope with? Are there things we can do? So the first step we have to do when we're anxious in order to overcome it, the very first step is to understand, what's my anxiety about? The thing I find really interesting about anxiety is you can have four people who are afraid of the same thing. Say they're afraid of driving in the car on the LA freeway, and each of those four people actually can have a different fear. One person might be afraid of getting in a car accident. A second person might be afraid of someone taking out a gun and shooting them while they're driving, and a third person might be afraid that they're going to have a panic attack and lose control of the car. So we all have very individual fears, even about the same situation. So the first step actually to getting over anxiety is to take some time and imagine ourselves not avoiding, but imagine ourselves staying in whatever situation or circumstance scares us, and let our imagery, just imagine it fully, and let our mind imagine what's the worst that we can imagine. What's the worst catastrophe that we're afraid of? And asking ourselves that question, what's the worst I can imagine, is actually the first step to overcoming anxiety, because we have to know what our fear is about before we can figure out ways to cope and handle it. Mm-hmm. So you want me to give you some examples?
That'd be great. Because as you were talking, I was thinking of, and I don't want to run ahead. I was just talking to a client where they utilized the system very well for a long time, and then at one point later on they were scaring themselves of too much of the same system. So, but first, I think the system really works. So, if you give me some examples of how that works, where you not only look at the worst possible scenario, but then you also look at the strength that you have in order to overcome those, right?
Yes, exactly. You want to look, we'll be able to then discover strengths and strategies within ourselves that can help us face up to whatever it is that's frightening us.
Right.
And, the kind of things that scare us are going to vary from person to person. But, let's take a common thing, which is people who are afraid of certain social situations. And usually with people who are afraid of social situations, the most common fear is people will criticize me, or I'll be humiliated, or people will reject and not like me. And so that might be one person's central fear. Other people have anxiety and they tend to worry about things, and people who worry a lot, their kind of main fear is often something along the lines of something bad's going to happen, and in worry, we can imagine 1,000,001 things that can go wrong in our lives. Something bad's going to happen, and I'm not going to be able to cope with it. And so it's like a big catastrophe will occur, and I'm just stuck with it. I won't be able to handle it. Other times people have more specific fears, like someone afraid of flying in airplanes might have a fear of the plane crashing, or there not being enough oxygen on board. So different types of anxiety are going to have different types of fears associated with them, but it's always going to be some kind of catastrophe that's either happening to us or people we love and care about, and that's going to have some really negative impact on our life, along with this idea that, and we're not going to be able to cope with it, so the bad thing is just going to move ahead going forward.
It's
now, of
also,
course,
Christine, it's also the anticipation, it seems like, which creates the worry. So when you keep yourself in that anticipation, obviously there's a particular space you get stuck on, because you never in your imagination, and none of this has happened, because when in reality something happens, we don't get stuck on it. We move on to whatever it is, and we behave and act toward whatever it is that we need to do to survive it and move on. But this mental image of the anticipation, and we keep holding ourselves in that space and not really move on to the threat itself, and then the coping, and moving on with the imagery that we created, with the horror film that we created. And that's what you're also, as I'm hearing you saying, that let's move on to what is the worst and then figure out what we're going to do. So, kind of fast forward this horror movie that we just created in our life and see what would be the end, right?
Exactly, yes. And in fact, good questions in anxiety are figure out what your worst is, what if fear is, what if this happens, but then quickly move to, well, then what? Then what will I do about it? Well, how can I manage that? How can I cope? To speak to your point, which is a really good one, I worked with a woman once who had panic attacks and agoraphobia, which meant she wasn't comfortable going outside of her safe zone. She had that for 50 years, and when I asked her, has anything ever gone wrong in her life, she described, of course, she was an older woman, and she described lots of things that had gone wrong in her life, some quite big, serious illnesses in her family and that sort of thing. And I said, how did you cope when those things happened? And she had to reflect and say, well, actually, I coped very well. So anxiety kind of traps us in these future fears. Oh, in the future, this thing's going to happen. But it doesn't let us reflect on and appreciate that when bad things have gone on, most of the time, people with anxiety cope just as well as anyone else does.
Mm-hmm. So, in order to understand our own anxiety, the first step would be to look at what the fear is and bring it into an imagery of, okay, this is what my real fear is, and name it. Not just allow it to be in this hovering space, but name it. And that's part of what allows us to get out of that avoidance, right? Because I've worked with a lot of people who they get dizzy and they'll be dissociated and they'll kind of be even out of their body and just way, kind of in the space, not bringing themselves and grounding in order, okay, let's bring the thought process back in and let's looking at naming it and seeing what it is. So, and then when we name it and see what it is, then have the understanding of maybe where it's coming from and where it's going, right?
That's right, yes. And what can I do about it? How can I handle this? How can I manage it? We sometimes talk in our offices about anxiety has a job to do, and anxiety's job is to scare the heck out of you, because if anxiety can really scare you, then it gets to hang around and be your best friend. And anxiety wants to kind of keep itself going. But we have a job, and our job is to kind of unmask anxiety. Our job is to say, is anxiety really just scaring me, putting these scary images in my head that are not likely to really happen? Is the danger that anxiety is telling me about really quite remote and unlikely, in which case it might shrink our sense of the danger? Or is anxiety really scaring me by saying I can't handle something that in reality, if I put a little time and effort into it, I actually could manage that. I could learn to deal with that. And so that's what anxiety is all about. It's about once you identify what the fear is, you then want to put your energy into learning to approach it and manage it and cope with it. And I would just say to any of your listeners who want to really tackle their anxiety, another thing they can do at the very beginning of these efforts is they can measure it. We have a measure of anxiety in our Mind Over Mood book in the anxiety chapter called the Mind Over Mood Anxiety Inventory that lets you rate your different physical reactions when you get anxious and some of the mental reactions you have. And you can measure it and then take these steps that you and I are going to be talking about. Mm-hmm. And if every week you measure your anxiety over a month or two, you're going to begin to see your anxiety scores going down the more you approach things and learn to cope with them.
Got it.
So measuring it's one thing you can do. But then there's some very clear things you can do that research shows reduce anxiety very quickly. The good news about anxiety treatment is for most people, if you have anxiety in just certain areas of your life, but you don't feel anxious in other areas, anxiety generally goes down very quickly, often over the matter of a few weeks or at most 8 to 10 weeks. Most anxieties can be treated. If you have anxiety over every area of your life, it might take a little bit longer, but probably not more than 6 months or so of practice. So that's the good news, is that anxiety is one of those moods that we can learn to manage. If we focus on it, we can learn to manage it fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. So everyone, you're listening to Inner Voice. I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine, and I'm speaking to Dr. Christine Padesky, who is a leading cognitive therapy innovator and a co-creator of strength-based cognitive behavioral therapy, and a co-author of Mind Over Mood book, which you can find in mindovermood.com. Christine, the other conversation that came up for me is in the understanding and identifying the anxiety before we can reduce it, and we'll get to that in a minute. Would it help also to understand and define whether some anxieties are the fears that are not based on reality, and how do we deal with that, versus things that are based on reality? There are things we got to do something about. So it's the message of, hello, this thing is coming up, you better be a little bit anxious and do something, versus just not like avoiding the conflict that is coming in front of you and you're watching it happen, versus some kind of like existential anxiety that we have over death or over being alone, or all the existential theories that are there, where almost everyone, regardless of their culture or age or all of that, at one point in their life they will face, the like phase of life changes that happen and the unknownness of the next phase and all of that. Would the difference between the type of anxiety or whatever it is that we're afraid of support us and help us understand, and then therefore would there be a difference in the way that we could take care of ourselves?
Well, interestingly, the same kind of approaches work for both of those things. I mean, there are common anxiety is part of the human condition. All of us feel anxious about certain things, and certainly at certain times of our life, different developmental points, people feel anxious before they get married. People feel anxious before they take a test. People feel anxious when they're getting older about what's going to happen to me. And the idea is that with all of these anxieties, if we identify what our fear is about and then take steps to prepare and plan and come up with a coping plan for managing it, it can help reduce our anxiety. So, for example, if you're worried about, if you're a young person and you're worrying, what if I don't get a job? Just worrying about that isn't going to help you get a job. But if you think, well, what are the things I need to do that will increase the odds that I will get a job? That is a better use of your time. So to take those steps. If you're an older person and you're wondering, who's going to take care of me if I should get ill, rather than just worrying about that, thinking about, well, what are the steps I could take? Who are the people who are possibilities? If I don't have anybody, what else can I do to make a plan so that if I do get sick or when I get sick, I've got a plan in place. So planning is part of dealing with anxiety, is figuring out what's a good plan, what's a good way of coping if this thing that I'm worried about comes about.
And you have discussed about in the book also about a theory 1 and theory 2. Can you explore those theories for us and let us know what they are?
Sure. Whenever we're anxious, we have an anxiety theory, and I'm just going to call that theory 1. Our anxiety theory is always something like, if this bad thing happens, then it will be terrible and there's no recovery from it. So that's usually, anxiety has a prediction. If we're socially anxious, we're predicting, if I go into this situation, I'm going to sound completely stupid and people are going to laugh at me and humiliate me. If we have panic disorder, which is something where we have panic attacks and we think we're going to be dying from our experiences, we might be thinking, if my heart beats fast, then I'm going to have a heart attack and I'm going to die. If we have a lot of worries, we think, if this bad thing happens, then I won't be able to cope. So that's theory 1. Theory 2 is the theory that someone who wasn't anxious might be having about that exact same thing. So theory 2 might be, if I go into this social situation, I might say something stupid, but if I do, people probably won't laugh at me and humiliate me. But even if they do that, I can cope with that. I can make a joke about it. I can say, wow, these aren't people I want to be friends with. Or I can just get through the situation and come out on the other side okay. Or if my heart beats fast, then it doesn't mean I'm having a heart attack. It probably means I'm feeling nervous and anxious. And over time, it'll just settle back down and it won't hurt me. Or theory 2 about worries might be, if something bad happens, then that'll be really unfortunate, but I'm pretty good at coping and I've got other people in my life who can help me. I will get through it. So theory 1 is the anxious theory. If this bad thing happens, it's catastrophic. Theory 2 is, if this bad thing happens, I will find a way to cope. I'll find a way to get through it. Now, everybody who's anxious has a theory 1, has a catastrophic theory. But if we struggle with anxiety more days than not, the odds are we don't have a very good active theory 2. So at very least, your listeners could start with a theory 2 of, if something bad happens, then I'll be able to cope with it. And I'll be able to get through it. Now, in order to test out Theory 1 and Theory 2, ideally, the more we can move to Theory 2, that I can cope with bad things happening, the less anxious we're going to be. Because at the beginning I said that anxiety, in order to be anxious, we have to have both danger and a sense we can't cope. So if we increase our confidence in our coping, then our anxiety is going to go down. So the best way to do that is to do lots of experiments where we actually approach and deal with the things that we're anxious about. A lot of people have heard the phrase face your fear. And the reason face your fear is so important is that the only way to increase our confidence that we can cope with bad things or challenging things is to actually expose ourselves to those challenging situations and practice different coping approaches. So let me say, for the different types of anxiety, there's different types of coping that will help. So for example, with social anxiety, if we're really afraid of people criticizing us, one of the best things we can do to overcome social anxiety is to practice coping with criticism. So I actually, with the people I work with in therapy, I have them develop a list of all the things people could criticize them for. Oh, you're stupid. Oh, I don't like how you dress. Oh, I don't think you're very attractive. And we make a list of all these criticisms that people worry about. And then I have them develop a script. I have them develop, what could you say if someone said you're not very attractive? And I help them develop something that I consider assertive. So rather than saying, oh, you're right, I'm ugly, and feeling bad, or instead of being aggressive and saying, you think I'm not attractive, you're really unattractive, which attacks the other person, I try to help them come up with something assertive in the middle, something that says something like, well, I'm sorry you don't find me attractive, but actually beauty has a lot to do with a person's character, and if you would get to know me, I think you'd find out I have a lot of wonderful qualities that you could grow to care about and love. And so I would have people practice that in their imagination, practice people saying critical, unkind things to them, and in their imagination, we would in therapy do it out loud. I'd have them practice assertively defending themselves against criticism until people become so confident that they can cope with criticism that it doesn't worry them anymore, and then their social anxiety goes down. Right. Because even though there's still some danger that somebody somewhere in the world is going to criticize them, their confidence in their own ability to cope with that criticism is so high that no longer they don't anymore feel anxious about it. So we even joke in therapy sometimes that they hope they get lucky, that someone will criticize them so they can practice assertive defense. But we can always practice this in our mind.
What I hear from you also is that when we go to this concept of the Theory 2 of looking at I can cope, there's two things that happens. One is that I start looking at the actual event that I'm afraid of, or the concept that I'm afraid of. Then when I say I cope, I can either look at the past and see that I do have the capacity and capability and the skills to cope with this, so that I can tap into that and be assured that that part of me which has this skill can come up anytime when that happens, and kind of integrate those parts of us. The second part, that if I get it that I don't have the skills, then I can go actually and find the skills or learn the skills to be able to do that. If something like that shows up. So in both of them, we tap into our strength, because we either tap into the strengths we have or the strengths of the capacity of learning or what we have. And you really focus on strength-based cognitive therapy, which no matter what is like bringing them into their own strength, right?
That's absolutely right. And those two parts are available to all of us. Mm-hmm. We can both look in the past and say, how have we coped? And we can, if we haven't been good at coping, we can say, okay, what are the things that people who do cope well do, and how can I learn to do that? Exactly. I think that's why you're seeing more anxiety in your practice in young people, including children, because we're now in a world where people are able to constantly be in touch with other people. And I'm a bit older than you are, and when I was growing up as a child, when we ran into things that we had to handle in our daily life, there was no one there. We were out playing by ourselves and had to figure out ways of coping with things, which I think in the long run made us feel pretty resilient, like we could cope with things. But many children today are never out of touch with an adult. So when they run into an obstacle or they encounter a difficulty, their mother or father or uncle or aunt or somebody's there to immediately help them through it. And that's not good in a way in terms of anxiety, because what a young child learns then is, if a problem comes up, an adult will solve it for me. Mm-hmm. And that then kind of gives them the message that I don't have the ability to cope, but adults do. As that child grows up, they may not develop greater confidence in their coping. I know many young adults in their 20s and 30s and 40s, when they encounter something at work or in their daily life, they get a warning on their car that something's going wrong, or a boss at work challenges them with something, and they feel a bit anxious. They immediately text their parents and say, "What should I do?" Mm-hmm. Now, this is a person, I know people who are successful attorneys and doctors, and yet they still text parents in the middle of the day and say, "Oh, this has come up. Well, how should I handle it?" Yeah. And instead of taking a moment and saying, what do I know that could help me handle this situation? What other situations have I been in like this? How could I handle it? And using this as an opportunity to increase their confidence in their own coping. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the dangers, I think, of technology, is that people don't engage their own brain first when they face a challenge. They immediately go to YouTube, or they Google it, or they text someone else to get advice. And while in the moment that helps people feel assured that they can handle problems, I think it sets up a stage where people can feel more anxious over time because they don't develop confidence in their own ability to think of a way to cope with a situation.
I also have sensed, beside what you were just explaining, I've also sensed that due to the gaming industry and the movies, and everybody supposedly are now have superhuman skills, and when you play in these games and are part of this virtual world, that you get to do anything you like with a couple of thumb-twirling, knobs. And then you come back to real life and you're like, oh, I don't have those superhumans, and I can't just push buttons and, I can jump over and do all of this stuff. And then there's a lot more anxiety about incapabilities of coping with what reality is on a day-to-day basis on the street, and dealing with each other and dealing with each other's personalities and how to cooperate, because a lot more we are not with each other and don't get the capacity and ability to figure out how to be with each other, because basically we all live in relationships. So most of the anxieties, although it might be about a task itself, a lot of it has to do with the essence of the relationship itself, where the task is part of. So they're very different than defined phobias, such as, okay, I'm afraid of swimming, or I'm afraid of, snake or flying. Those are different. We're talking a lot more of anxieties have to do with the apparent concept of maybe I can't handle, like the example you said at the beginning, what are they going to think of me, the judgment, or a fear of loss of someone in our life, and loss of our identity, loss of face, loss of all of that, which then turns into also anxiety.
Yes, I think I share your concerns about that, because I think the sense of there is to a certain degree, another part of dealing with anxiety is we need to learn to tolerate a certain amount of anxiety, and to recognize that it is we both don't have, and it's not desirable to have a 10-second solution to anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that happens in our new internet texting rapid fire experience of the world virtually online and through video games and all of that is people have a sense that, if something's not working well, you should be able to solve that problem in 10 seconds or 20 seconds, or, as you say, take a few, move the joystick or make some keystrokes. And that's not really a good way to think about anxiety, because, first of all, we need to tolerate anxiety to understand what it's about. And there is a lot of anxiety in daily life, moment to moment. Things happen where we temporarily feel anxious. And rather than trying to get away from that very quickly through just immersing yourself in your phone or a text message or something like that, sometimes anxiety has messages to teach us, and there's part of the human condition. I am vulnerable. I can't quickly handle everything. And there's some benefits to learning to tolerate that and manage that and say, okay, so, let's say we're trying to learn and grow and get better in our relationships, for example. There's a lot of anxiety required to have true intimacy with someone, to deal with conflict in a relationship. But if we don't face that anxiety and find courage within ourselves to approach those situations, it's going to damage our relationships over time. We're never going to be able to have the depth of relationship that I know you talk about on your program, where we really need to have the courage to be with other people and deal with difficulties. And so those are the more normal types of anxiety situations that everybody deals with. Mm-hmm. And by learning to tolerate anxiety and live with it and accept it and know that we can handle a certain amount of anxiety for a pretty long length of time and be approaching things that are challenging for us, can have a great deal of satisfaction in the end. So if we handle anxiety, say, of a challenging job, if we're avoiding anxiety, we might just work in a job that's not hard at all for us. But think of the challenges we sometimes face in doing something difficult. If we're able to get out on the other side of it and learn that we can learn that new difficult skill, there's a great deal of excitement and satisfaction in that. Similarly in relationships, dealing with approaching conflict and talking to somebody and being intimate and taking a risk, there's anxiety attached to that. But if we're able to break through the other side and have greater intimacy with someone, there's a real upside and pleasure and joy in facing some of our fears.
Yes. Also, part of the let's say, story that we create for ourselves, some of it has to do with unrealistic expectations that we set forth and then create anxiety over it, such as like the concept of perfectionism. We create this out of the realm of reality standards that we don't even know what it is. Like I've actually, at times with clients, I said, okay, let's sit down and create your standards because I really want to know and measure the standards. So maybe we could get to it. I don't know. And rarely, if somebody has a perfectionism, we could come up with tangible standards and measurements that anyone on the face of the earth could create. And that's what I said, sometimes with these movies, we have lost the concept that this is a movie and we think we should have those superhuman, advantages of all of it. But I've seen that a lot more where, for example, even talking about having the radio show or a podcast for 50 minutes or an hour, and a lot of people are telling me, nobody listens for an hour anymore. Just give them one minute tips. And I'm like, okay, that would be really, really in-depth conversation of 1 minute tip. And if people are just getting 1 minute tips, what are they doing with it? But what happens is that they expect, actually, the audience and the listeners expect with a 1 minute tip to be able to completely have all the skills that they actually need to have. So that then it again comes, is that realistic? Like, could I actually perfect myself in driving or have good skills in driving if I was just going around listening to 1-minute tips about driving? Like, is there any skills in the world that you can actually just gain by 1-minute tips? So then I keep facing these expectations that we put on ourselves. And then we're anxious, as if I just set the scenario up and then have this idea that everybody else does it and I'm the only one who cannot have it. And then, I set up all these negative thoughts about myself, which then produces a lot of anxiety. Have you also experienced that lately?
Yes, and there has been actually a lot of research on this topic in terms of social comparison, that people go on the internet, and part of what drives both depression and anxiety in internet use is they found that people who are on Facebook, for example, more than other people actually have a greater risk for depression and anxiety. And similarly with young people on Instagram and some of the other social media sites, what the research shows is that if people go on these sites and they think this represents other people's lives in a balanced way, they actually, because of comparing themselves, they see someone who has all these posts of having fun and being happy and, oh, this good event happened and that good event happened, and they then think, oh, my life is much more complicated than that. I'm not doing very well. And they can actually then feel more depressed or more anxious comparing themselves to other people. I think a very interesting exercise to do for people who are prone to that is to look at their own Instagram and Facebook account or whatever social media they use and say, if you look at the posts that you've made in the last month, and if that's all you knew about your life, how would your life look? Mm-hmm. Does this represent your whole life? Or are you just posting like the best moments? Mm-hmm. And even sometimes those best moments are somewhat fake because, people might go to a party and actually not be having a very good time. But they get out their cell phone and they take a selfie and they have a big smile and they have a lot of action in the background and they post it as if this represented their evening at their party, right. Where in fact, most of the time they might have been feeling quite miserable, but they create this kind of fake smiling picture because they want to have a post that looks good. So I think this is the kind of the underbelly or the downside of social media, is that we don't really get a balanced view. And, in the past, people would, you would say, how are you doing today? And people would say, oh, I'm doing great, even if we weren't doing great. Right. So there is a human tendency to, we just want to say the kind of positive thing that we think people want to hear. Mm-hmm. But in fact, we need to be aware that things that are posted online or things that are posted in a video game, they're not real life. This is why we call it virtual reality. It's a pretend version of reality that doesn't give us the whole picture.
Yes, and I think that this disconnect that happens between who we really are and connect to ourselves versus this image, the addiction to this image of perfectness that we've created also creates and heightens anxiety. So
yes, it does.
I want people to be able to find you. So you can find Dr. Christine Padesky at Padesky.com, Padesky.com. And you can also go to mindovermood.com to learn about the book and I think you have a lot of exercises there, and you have record outcomes and forms, and all of those are actually in this book, which has been translated to 12 languages and 8 more in progress. That's awesome. So
that's right, yes.
Yeah.
And the Padesky.com site is actually just for mental health professionals, so if there are therapists listening to this broadcast, that would be for them. But the mindovermood.com is where we put information for the general public about moods and how to manage them. And as you say, there's worksheets there and information on the various translations of the book for people whose first language is not English.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me and to our listeners. And I definitely hope to have you consistently back on my show whenever that you have the latest research that you work on and everything that you want to share with us. So it's been a joy to have you.
That would be my pleasure, and it's been a great pleasure to talk with you as always.
Wonderful. And everyone who are listening, thank you for listening with your heart. And until next week, create an amazing world for yourself and everyone around you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to The Inner Voice with Dr. Foojan Zeine, only on LA Talk Radio.